So, all right, we'll start this again. So welcome everybody to the Brown Bag. From undergraduate research, we are lucky today to have Dr. FitzGerald, who is from the Department of History, going to be talking to us about it's a curator's job to listen, collaboration in public history. She'll give a presentation and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. So I will turn this over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's get my slides up. It was brought to my attention that I missed an opportunity to call this presentation Stop, Collaborate, and Listen, but I'm going to go with the current title and we'll see where we get. So what I want to talk about today is my experience as a public historian, as a working curator, and I'm going to be a little vulnerable. I'm going to talk about, I wouldn't call it a mistake that I made, but I'm going to talk about how I executed an exhibit and realized that I could have improved on it, and then what I did to improve on it. So I'm going to share a little bit about some shortcomings and how I built on those in the service of learning about best practices in public history. So before joining us here at VSU, I was a curator at a site called Rancho Los Cerritos Historic Site. It's a historic house museum in Long Beach, California. And it's a combination of a permanent exhibit, which is the furnished historic house, and a separate rotating exhibit space. And so I had numerous roles as curator, managing the permanent exhibit, managing the collections, and developing and installing rotating temporary exhibits on various topics related to the history and culture of the site and of the region. And I also managed the archives, managed the research library. It was a very small site, and so with small sites, you wear many hats. I was also in charge of the concert series, which is certainly not something I prepared for in graduate school, but it was part of the job. So that's a big difference between a small site and a big site, right? At a big site here at the Smithsonian, you're very specific in what you're curating. But at Rancho Los Cerritos, there was one curator, it was me, and so did a lot of different things there. Collaborated a lot with staff and volunteers on programs and things like that. But what I want to talk specifically today is the exhibits component of what I did. So I want to introduce a little theory, just a little. This concept of reflective practice. Here's a photograph of Rancho Los Cerritos. This is the entering courtyard when you walk in, and this home is the furnished permanent exhibit. So a little theory called reflective practice. Now this is adapted from teaching. This is adapted from an educational theory. And it's adapted and specified to public history. And so this is helpful to think about some of the distinguishing features of public historians and what they do. So for public historians, a distinguishing feature is audience, right? It's the general public of all ages and educational levels, collaborating with stakeholders, so not necessarily just collaborating with other scholars and experts, but also with all the different types of technical support, volunteers, interns, community members involved in exhibits and other projects, and reflective practice. That is another distinguishing feature of public history that I'm going to use to kind of guide the story that I want to share with you today. So again, it originated in educational theory, but it's been adapted to public history. And as this visual demonstrates, reflective practice is a cycle. It's not linear, it's a cycle. It's constantly building on your experiences, what you produce, and using feedback to build on your experiences. And so this was definitely part of my work at Rancho Los Cerritos. And so I'm going to give an example of how I produced an exhibit. I feel that I fell short on it. I feel that it could have been better. And so how I developed my knowledge from that experience to improve on the next exhibit. And I will return to this slide. So I developed an exhibit called Building a New California, The Lives and Labor of Chinese Immigrants from 1850 to 1930. And this was focused on the contributions of Chinese immigrants in the Los Angeles area in that time period. And so this exhibit was very research-based. Most of the primary and secondary source materials that I consulted came from the museum's collections. We have an archive at the museum, so I really worked largely in-house for both the physical object collections. These were largely donations or acquisitions over time. And then the archives included a lot of research material. So I really worked in-house on this exhibit. But I've been taught the importance of working with the communities you represent in exhibits and different projects and endeavors. And so once I had drafted an outline of what the exhibit was going to look like, and also identified, the objects that we would use. I pulled photographs. Once I'd done all that, I reached out to members of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. That's the organization in the region that was, really the best match to collaborate on this project. And so they were really enthusiastic about the project. They graciously read over my draft of the outline, reviewed my plans for the exhibit, shared feedback. And later on, once the exhibit had been installed, one of the representatives was contacted by the local newspaper. And they were very complimentary in the newspaper. They were very, supportive of it. They gave a statement and they were very excited. Their organization was very excited about the exhibit. Several members of the organization attended the exhibit's opening reception, expressed their excitement about the project. So that all sounds great, right? Sounds like success, a win. Not quite. Here's why. So while I worked with members of the local Chinese community on this exhibit, I really feel that my efforts fell short. I could have done a lot more to ensure that they were true stakeholders in the exhibit, in all aspects of the exhibit. What I could have done is brought them in from the beginning to talk about goals, talk about research questions, talk about sources, even talk about what objects would be included. So that's something I could have done. It would have been a more collaborative process from the beginning, which would have created a much more dynamic, a much more inclusive exhibit, and potentially established a stronger relationship between Rancho Los Cerritos and the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, going beyond the exhibit. And so while they were given the opportunity to provide feedback on the exhibit's content, the interpretive decisions had already been made. And they were really able to comment on a pretty well-developed outline. So they were limited in the feedback and the contributions they could make. And so they really didn't have much to add because the project was so close to completion. So the exhibit turned out well. It was very informative. It was visually appealing. It was really well received by visitors. And it expanded the interpretation of Rancho Los Cerritos. This was an area of the site and the region's history that needed more discussion. And so this really brought that in. It added more to what history the site was sharing. And again, it was well received by visitors. It was well received by members of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. But I knew it could have done more. And so knowing this really guided my approach to the next exhibit. And so with the exhibit that followed, Building New California, I implemented some changes using reflective practice. So I'll go back to the reflective practice slide. So as I was working on the Building a New California exhibit, I identified the need to collaborate with stakeholders, collaborate more with my stakeholders, and then determine that in the future I would apply what I'd learned from that experience. So this brings us to Tebahagna to today. That's how you pronounce that word, Tebahagna. That is the name of a village site of the indigenous people of the region where Rancho Los Cerritos is located in Southern California, in Long Beach. And so that was a Tongva village site pretty much on the land where Rancho Los Cerritos is today. And so that was the name of the exhibit, Tebahagna to Today, Stories of the Tongva People. And so creating an exhibit about the Tongva people had been a goal of mine since I started at Rancho Los Cerritos. Creating an exhibit that focused on the indigenous people of that land, of that region, would add more diversity, more inclusion in the perspectives that we featured at the museum and exhibits and other interpretation. The Tongva are a really important part of the site's history, but they are also significant in the current day in the contemporary perspective and part of the community in Long Beach in Southern California. And so a major challenge that I faced was that we didn't really have any collections related to Tongva. We really didn't have much documentation in archives. There was very limited presence in our collections overall. And so I relied on reflective practice to address these issues. So when I first began the early stages of developing Tevahagna to today, I changed the first steps of exhibit development from what I had done in the past and implemented the initial step of the reflective practice flowchart by setting problems, right up here, setting problems, assessing goals, and reaching out to stakeholders from the beginning, bringing in stakeholders, rather than once I'd established the parameters of what the exhibit would look like. This made a significant difference. So what this looked like for me was identifying one potential partner to start with, who I had worked with on a previous project. So the man on the top right, his name is Craig Torres. I had worked with him in the past. He came and gave a talk on indigenous foodways and land use. And he is a Tongva educator and scholar who's very active in the community. He's collaborated with other museums, with universities in the area. And so I reached out to him, built on a relationship we already had, and told him my plans, told him that I really wanted to do a Tongva exhibit. I wanted to work with him and other people in the Tongva community. And so we talked about potential approaches, research goals, and I also asked him to connect me with other people. That was really key for him, to connect me with others in the community who could be collaborative stakeholders in the exhibit. So he was really integral in helping me develop a committee of Tongva educators, scholars, experts, who all helped me shape the exhibit from the beginning, which was key, from the beginning. And so in this photo are members of the committee who I worked with. And so standing to Craig's left, so on our right, the woman in the white blouse, her name is Desiree Martinez, and she is an archaeologist. And she is an indigenous archaeologist. So bringing indigenous perspectives and approaches into archaeology is a really important shift in how that field is implemented, how that expertise is implemented. And so she was really integral with the archaeological aspect and also research. Sitting in the red blouse is Julia Bogany. She specializes in Tongva language and children's education. And standing behind her in the purple sweater is Cindy Alvitre. And she is a professor of Native American Studies at the local college, Cal State University, Long Beach. And she also works with archaeology collections, and she also does indigenous art and is very focused on Tongva maritime culture as well. So they all had different areas of expertise, they all had different perspectives, and so this committee really informed the approaches and the interpretive framework of the exhibit Tevahagna to today. And the collaborative nature of our work made a significant difference in the whole process and the outcome of the exhibit. It's so important to work with the communities you represent, and that was really the goal of this exhibit. And so by working with members of the Tongva community, it wasn't just about having a great exhibit, it was also about establishing and cultivating ongoing relationships beyond the timeline of the exhibit. And so I noted as I continued, going back to our flowchart, I noted as I continued through the flow and the cycle of reflective practice, I paid close attention to the barriers and opportunities as the project developed. So I remembered being told early in my career, when I was starting out as a curator, I was given the very good advice that rather than acting as an expert on every project I did, rather than acting as the representative, it is the curator's job to listen. That's where the title of this talk comes from. It is the curator's job to listen. That really became a mantra through this exhibit, but through all my work that I did at the Rancho. It's the curator's job to listen, learn, and find ways to share what they've learned. And so working with the Tongva community on this project was a really powerful opportunity to put this advice into practice. So of course there were barriers. I don't want to give the impression that now that I brought in stakeholders early, there's rainbows and butterflies. We definitely faced challenges as many small nonprofits doing this type of work do. And so some of the barriers, of course, were funding, limited space to do an exhibit, against our dreams of what the exhibit could look like. Didn't always fit the square footage. The collections, right? We still have this issue of having very limited collections. And then just navigating the different goals of the people on the committee. They were a lovely group. They worked well together, but Indigenous people are not a monolith. No group, no community is a monolith. They had different goals. They had different ideas. They didn't always agree on how to implement this exhibit. And so navigating that while maintaining trust with the awareness that I'm a white representative of a museum, which has a really problematic historical relationship with Indigenous people, was a dance. It was very much, something that we had to navigate. So I talked about collections, right? I mentioned that we had this limitation of collections. So this was another problem. We had, when I worked there, a collection of baskets at Rancho Los Cerritos. And so in the back of my mind, in planning this Tongva exhibit, which, I hoped for years to eventually do, in the back of my mind, I thought, okay, maybe there's something in those baskets that we can work with. So I thought at least some would be Tongva. So we brought in an expert basket assessor. His name is Gabe Sanchez. He's photographed here with me looking at baskets. He's an expert basket weaver. And so he's really knowledgeable about the history and the traditions of basket weaving. He could look at a basket and know what materials it's made from, where it comes from. And so we invited him to the site to assess our basket collection. He determined that none of them were Tongva, not a one. 23 baskets in this museum, not one is from the ground the museum is on. I won't go too off tangent, but this is a legacy of this popular basket trading industry in the 1920s, 1930s in California and other places. It was very trendy to have Native American baskets. And so some rich white people owned this house in the 30s. That's probably how the baskets ended up there, long story short. And so none of these are Tongva. One basket is from the Chumash, which is a neighboring Indigenous community, neighboring but not Tongva, right? A neighboring community but not Tongva. So this was another barrier that I faced in the process. No Tongva collection in our museum, and we were planning an exhibit. So we ended up being able to do the exhibit after all. So here I am working with some interns on installing the exhibits, and yes, it really is that fun. The joy in our face is real. So the objects that we used were mostly personal loans. They were mostly personal loans from that community I worked with, the committee I worked with, and their contacts. And so pretty much everything on exhibit was a personal belonging of a Tongva person in the community. And this really emphasized the fact that Indigenous people are not people of the past, right? This is a shortcoming. This is a message that comes across in the way museums and individuals often talk about Indigenous people, that they are people of the past. Native Americans are people of the past. So by having contemporary items from people in the Indigenous community to say on the labels that this belongs to, this person, that really emphasized that the Tongva are part of the community today. And so the exhibit featured a variety of objects, including plant materials to talk about the different uses of plant materials, textile pieces, art, archaeological items, tools, jewelry, games, dolls, right? All these different aspects of Tongva culture, Tongva history, and also model tiats and tiat building materials. Tiats are traditional canoes used by the Tongva in coastal communities. And we conducted extensive research in archives outside of our own, in the region, local archives, libraries, special collections that hold materials information about the Tongva. And we also featured oral history in the exhibit. Oral history is a really important aspect of Indigenous culture and knowledge. And so we interviewed members of the Tongva Advisory Committee, and we shared their stories. What they said in these oral histories is what ended up in the exhibit. So we shared their stories. They gave input, they reviewed our research, they reviewed our writing for the exhibit. And so this really ensured that the exhibit, from the beginning and woven throughout, represented Indigenous voices and perspectives. Visibility was a really big part of this project, visibility for Indigenous people. It was a goal of theirs, and it was something that was really important for us to accomplish. So we also featured a series of public educational programs to go on along with the exhibit. So this was another aspect of public outreach. It was another aspect of the educational component of this overall project. So this allowed us to further engage the community, further establish our relationships with the Tongva communities as partners and as collaborators. So we had a variety of different workshops. This was another basket expert who was talking about basket weaving and basket history in his workshop. So here are some photos of the exhibit's opening. It was very well attended, and it brought in new audiences. It brought in people who had not been to the site before. And so this was one reason why the exhibit was a success, right? That's the goal for a nonprofit to do an exhibit and bring in new audiences is a big goal. It also expanded our interpretation, brought more diversity and inclusion to the stories that we tell, and it challenged common narratives of Indigenous museum representation. People commented, you know, how refreshing it was to come in and not just see baskets or, you know, archaeological items. So it, you know, really challenged these common narratives to have the Indigenous people there, the Tongva community there, greeting people, saying, hey, that belongs to me, and telling people their stories. So that challenged people's perceptions of what maybe they had previously seen in museum spaces. And then we put the exhibit online, right? So continuing accessibility, continuing engagement with the public. And so going back to our reflective practice cycle, kind of the final step in thinking about this. So I found patterns that worked well, and I found some where we could improve. Once again, it's a cycle. So thinking about the next exhibit or the next project. So what worked really well was collaborating early. Collaborating early, collaborating closely worked really well for us. Thinking beyond the museum's collections for research, not being limited by what is housed and owned by the museum, that really worked well for us. What we could improve moving forward is making it more accessible for children. Making the exhibit more accessible for children. The workshops, some of the workshops were focused for children, but as far as bringing kids through the exhibit, that could have been expanded a bit more. We realized that was really emphasized for us when we brought school tours through of fourth graders, and some of the signs were a little high for them, you know, things like that. So physically the space, but also bringing in more interactive components would have been great. Of course, that would have been a challenge because COVID hit not long after this exhibit went up, and so that would have been a challenge. But you know, in thinking about the grand scheme of what really works in exhibits and what really works with children's education, moving forward, the next step in future situations, what we would apply is to continue the collaboration, continue the variety of programs, continue making things accessible online, but would also keep children in mind as well, making sure there was an interactive component, maybe vary the sign levels a little bit so little ones can see that as well. So that is the way that I use this reflective practice cycle to build from one exhibit to the next, and then to think about what to do for future exhibits. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take that back down to site. You have to exit out of this one. Can you hit escape? There we go. All right, that way we can see the people in our room. Okay, well, thank you to all the people in the room. I'm going to turn our camera on now so you can see us and our pretty faces. And we will open up the floor for all questions. So who has our first question?
Does it have to be a query or can it be
It could be a comment.
Okay, what I was struck with right when you started talking about a cycle of reflective practice from education. That's, I've switched from the natural sciences to the social sciences, and my doctorate's actually in science education. And it right away started to trigger things. And one of the things it triggered was this thing about learning cycle theory that they do all the time. You have the 3 E's: exploration, explanation, and then extension, and that they were pushing us in science education to do this, and they kept saying, well, that mimics how science really happens, which is cyclic, because you start with an inductive piece where you go out and look, you always observe first, and then you decide what you want to study. And they used to make kids memorize, you start with a hypothesis. Well, a hypothesis is not a guess you take out of thin air. A hypothesis is something based on observation. So it reminded me, when I got away from the learning cycle theory, I thought this is really what science does, because we have like ideas, we go outside and we observe something, and then you design studies and develop hypotheses based on what you've learned in the inductive piece of that, and then you do the deductive piece, which is testing. So it's observation and testing, and then refining it and observing and testing. So I don't know, that was just a comment I didn't. Am I faking the parallel, or is it really there?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's the experimentation and then,
See what happens.
Yeah,
adjust, and
absolutely.
then you observe things, and then you do it again. And science, they talk about science being cyclic, and for so long, science education has forced people to think science is really linear. You pull a hypothesis out of thin air, and then you develop your experiment and test it, and then you analyze it, and that's it. That's not what happens in real science, real natural science,
Right.
or real social science either. We got enough social scientists around here, because it's very cyclic in social science too, when you're working on human subjects and stuff, right? So it makes a lot of sense, and I was taking copious notes, because that's the only way scientists learn. Is I think I can't learn and think as well if I'm not writing something down.
I feel that way too.
Oh, okay. I thought it was
I
odd.
definitely feel that way too. I see my students, nothing in front of them, and I thought, wow, I wish I could do that too. Wink, wink.
That's why I started making them answer questions at the beginning of class. They actually have to think of, although some of them are not really letting you think about either them.
Yeah.
Try to make them actually engage in thinking about what they're supposed to think about. Yeah, I don't know how to think, especially if subjects come back to you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Knowles, you have your hand up, figuratively speaking.
My automated hand. That talk was a pleasure, Dr. FitzGerald.
We're turning the volume up. We can't hear you very well.
Okay. How's that? Can you hear me better now? Yeah?
Got it.
That was a pleasure to hear that talk, Dr. FitzGerald. One of the things that I wish we had more students in here. I see nobody in the audience that needs to be convinced of this, but I like the notion that when you're working with indigenous populations as a non-indigenous scholar, you have to understand who you're dealing with. You can't treat them as objects or subjects. There's cultural context there. And I really appreciate you bringing that to light. And I'm sure from what I've heard, you bring it to light in your classes. And I've been meaning to find you and compliment you on that. So I appreciate the message you're bringing forward. And
Thank you.
you need to talk to Dr. Haggard there and see if we can't work up some stuff to do for NAIS, because we need more of that perspective in there. So maybe you could develop some sort of course that's NAIS appropriate for history, and we can cross-list it.
Just get that plug in there, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am shameless. A shameless hustler.
Where's the next meeting gonna be?
The next meeting.
NAIS, isn't that what you're talking about? That's a society, right?
No, that's the minor, Native
Oh,
American.
for the Native American Studies here. Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay.
That's all right. There's a lot of acronyms floating in the air out there.
I just saw it on somebody's credentials. I won't mention any names, but it's in your signature now on emails. Because and so I thought, oh, good, they're recognizing it as a program. I saw that today because when I was signing your book, I wanted to spell Lavana right, and I didn't know if I needed to capitalize this the V. But I think that's really interesting. And I have another question, because obviously I teach the natural sciences, and I qualify them because they're not the only sciences, and I go both ways because I do social and natural science. And that makes me bi-methodological, and I love doing that too, just to disrupt heteronormativity too. But one of the things that I'm teaching right now is human evolution. And when I teach this, I want to talk about how humans started in Africa and spread, but I still need to learn from somebody, not mentioning any names, about how to get over this Bering Strait model that I've always been taught, and how, what should I teach as a better model, or how can I incorporate other ideas in it? I know we got to have a long talk about that, but one of the things I wrote down was Indigenous people are not people of the past, and that's because I get so excited when I think about Indigenous cultures. And I try to share that with my students, and I say, look at all these people all over the world, because I do that the day I talk about human evolution. And then the next lecture is the inheritance of human skin colors. And so I try to show them that we have skin colors based on where our ancestors were located. And that part, the natural science, is pretty firm now. Finally, we understand that you protect your skin, you protect yourself from losing vitamin B9 from intense ultraviolet radiation. And that happened first when our ancestors came out of trees. And then as we moved away from the equator, you had to have paler skin to allow ultraviolet radiation to penetrate the skin, so you could make vitamin D and be healthy for bones. So anyway, I just talk a lot about Indigenous people, and I'm trying to learn a new respect, and a better way to talk about it as an Anglo that stands up there with my embedded white values, but I love talking about it, so that's a start. And I'm going to get lessons on the Bering Strait so I can change that narrative.
So I appreciate the attention to it. Dr. Hager and Dr. Lovern are both in NAIS as faculty members along with me, as is Dr. Parra, Erica Parra. And I'm always trying to pull other people to the dark side and encourage them to write curriculum and to present classes so I can broaden the curriculum. So I really do appreciate the attitude, generally speaking.
I wanted to ask you about, we've got now the new track in history on the public history. Has it been difficult to get students to understand the difference between public history and regular history? Are you having a lot of influx?
I'm having good attendance, and so, we do that on the first day. We ask, why are you here? What brought you here? What are you interested in? What do you know about public history? And so I haven't really come across resistance to this difference of maybe how this class is different from their other history classes, or how it's different from academic history. There seems to be a real openness to it, and because the class incorporates so much hands-on practice, you're physically doing what public historians do. We write labels, we do exhibits, we go on field trips, and so that, in addition to all the theory and reading and writing, so I think that's helpful. But I am fairly certain that there are students who sign up and don't know what the class is until they arrive. And so that's both for all my public history classes. Day one is really, what is public history? How is it similar to academic history? How does it support academic history? I don't want to think of them as a script divide, but then how are they different? Cordell, do you mind if I put you on the spot as a public history student? Yeah.
So your first class last fall, your intro to public history course, I remember that day you're like, yeah, so why did you sign up for this class? Probably 3/4 of the students were like, it sounded interesting, it fit into my schedule.
Mm-hmm.
This semester's class, 3/4 of the students had some sort of I'm interested in this, I want to do this. One student said he wanted to be a curator. I was saying, it's something I want to do for my thesis. There was a lot of students that this semester kind of came in with a little bit more understanding, but there still was a couple that were like, it sounded interesting and fit in my schedule, or I signed up for it. But there was less of that. More people seemed to, even within just a year, more people seem to be coming in with a little bit of an idea of what it is. And I think as you build your program, you'll start attracting students more and more that are like, oh, I didn't know that's what that was called. I want to do that sort of thing.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I think, students talking to other students, but also advising, and our department chair and outreach has been able to provide, more information about public history, which is quite helpful. I did not know what public history was until graduate school. I loved museums, I loved history. I didn't know how they came together. Like as an undergraduate, it never crossed my mind that this could be a field or a profession. So, I'm encouraged to see, our department head meeting students, incoming freshmen at outreach saying, they want to be a museum curator, because that was not something that I or my friends were talking about, coming into college. So that's really interesting too. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that. We had more history majors in the class too this time around.
Yeah, last time there was a lot of interdisciplinary studies, a lot of, I think, an elective, and this one's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
This year, I think there's one student in there, Cameron, who sits right behind me in the classroom. He's an art student.
Yeah.
And just like, I knew an elective, and I like
Art
history,
makes a
so
lot of
this is
sense
kind
for
cool.
museums though.
But yeah, it's perfect for him to be in that class. He's in my group. I'm really glad he is. His skill set is going to be really helpful.
Yeah.
Designing.
So we'll see where the program goes and what students expect coming in, but so far it is in my curriculum to explain what public history is from day one, because I have to explain that to educated graduate.
And in a nutshell,
Yeah.
it is, can you do a one sentence for somebody who, what are we talking about?
Public history is,
I was discriminating, but.
to be put very simply, is history that is accessible outside of the classroom for the general public. So that includes, museum exhibits, history tours, archives, historic monuments, podcasts, documentaries, websites, video games. It's really broad. It's history that's accessible outside of the classroom.
And in science, they named that informal science, and then the people that were doing it felt like it was being denigrated because at our national science education meetings, there was a whole stream of, a strand of informal education, which is exactly what you just said. And then they renamed it non-formal science, which I don't know, really, if it made them feel better, the people that did it, but it was everything you did, outside of classrooms was called informal science education.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're talking about, making it more accessible in the real places.
So what is history?
So history is the study of change over time. And I would say that history, the difference between academic history and public history is really methodology and audience. And so while public history uses primary and secondary sources, with academic history, I'm seeing it move away from this, but there's less of an expectation of going outside of documentary sources. But I would say that the main difference between academic history and public history is audience. Audience and who the stakeholders are. So, and who you're collaborating with, right? So with academic history, you're very often collaborating with scholars and collaborating with the communities that you're writing about or, creating a piece about. Where with public history, you're also working with kind of the technical side of it, right? You're working with lighting experts, you're working with exhibit installers, you're working with contractors, you're working with artists, So I think that's the big difference is audience and stakeholders who you're collaborating with. But done well, if academic historians and public historians are doing their job well, in my not subtle opinion, there should be no real difference in sources. Because I think academic historians should not limit themselves to just written primary and secondary sources. They should be using audiovisual, they should be using artifacts. And public historians should not just be dealing with artifacts, they should also be doing serious research. I think the research questions should be the same. The way that they approach historical methods should be the same. So I really think it's audience methodologies, as far as how it's implemented to access larger audience.
So is public history more interdisciplinary?
It doesn't have to be, but yes, I would say at this moment in the profession it is, yeah.
Is that a radical view to the old historians sitting here?
I'm interdisciplinary.
Okay.
You can't do Native American stuff without being interdisciplinary.
Okay, you're right. So, but what would the old white, we used to call them white shirts?
Go with the classics that we've had in our department. It's I'm gonna go to the resources, I'm gonna write about what I wanna write about, and they, a lot of times, they're not even writing when they write for the public to read it. They're writing for an academic source. My first publication was literally for an academic source, because I was actually writing for a class I was in, and the professor convinced me to publish it, and I did, but I was using language I would not use.
Cycles of talking to each other, right?
Right, and that's, and a lot of times, that's what you get in journal articles, but, you know, a lot of people don't.
In every field though, right? It's not different in any field.
Published behind a paywall.
So is this a radical view that the public piece should be connected? You know, I mean, is she radical in saying that?
Not for me, it is. I mean, that's.
Okay, yeah, I'm asking, okay.
I have worked with a lot of people that come from the very staid, there's a certain way you do this and that's it, and I don't really care what the average person says about this. But that's also the same person that doesn't care about, if they're a professor, they don't really care about what their student thinks about.
Oh, that's true, okay.
So, I mean, technically, public history may actually open up, the more we do public history, the more it opens up what we're probably gonna do in an academic setting with our students. And it's also about bringing research to the students. So, you know, there's the isolation. I'm going to do my research, and I'm just going to focus on my little groups of people. And there's a trend of public history pulling us
Yes.
farther into something that to me, has more value.
So with public history, I am seeing more and more examples of, you know, maybe traditionally trained academic historians who are doing exhibits with their students, you know, and so I'm seeing it more of a move of that, where the lines are being blurred, as they should be, because I think that there shouldn't be a huge difference other than, you know, audience and some of the methods, but I think it's, you know, if you were to ask other historians, I don't know if they would be as open-minded as Dr. Hunter, because working with Indigenous people, right off the bat, you need to respect oral history. That is an area that's, I would say, less of a debate in history than it used to be, but in public history and working with Indigenous people, you have to respect traditional knowledge, and that's something that, you know, the very like Western trained historians, they're looking at written sources. That's an area of tension that I think is.
If we start talking about oral history, there's oral tradition, and then there's oral history of the individual. Okay, and there's a lot of historians ignore the oral history of the individual, but then they also question the oral tradition that's been handed down. It doesn't have to be scientifically accurate to have value. It has to, and what is understood in a tradition has multiple values in multiple ways, and you have to be open to be able to explore those ways and let them tell you what it means. But then the story of the individual is something else. And when you're getting that story, sometimes the story of the individual over time becomes the oral tradition. And so you can, native storytelling doesn't have to be connected to the distant past. Native storytelling can be, you know, when you get into the spiritual, we have a problem with, oh, we're going to set aside because they always treat this as a traditional place of spiritual value. But that can occur at any point in time, because time's not linear anyway. And so it can occur. And it's the same with the person. The personhood has value. And a lot of historians ignore that, except for that little thing, oh, you saw this, tell me about what you saw, as opposed to telling me your story. Does that make any sense?
Makes really good sense, yeah. Catherine has her hand up. Fire away.
Catherine, are you there?
Are you muted?
Yeah, I just muted myself. So I hope I didn't miss this, but I was wondering, Sarah, if you could talk a little bit about the kind of reflective content, or how the reflective practice maybe shaped the design element, maybe less so than the content of the exhibit. Does that make sense? Like, for example, like when you were talking about like setting up the lighting and how to put the display together, how, like, were there conversations about how to use space and how to maybe I'm not exactly sure how to articulate it, but, you know, like apart from maybe the narrative of the conversation, and also I know I just broke up, so I don't know if any of that went through. So does the question make
No,
sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I heard everything and I have an answer. So that's a great question because that's like the technical aspect of putting exhibits together. And I referred to the fact that one of our challenges was the space.
Mhm.
So the exhibit space that we were using was small and had an odd shape to it. And one of the issues was that when you entered the space, it was not obvious where the exhibit began and where it ended and where people should start, you know? And so kind of like watching people's path of travel with the Building a New California exhibit gave me ideas for how to make it really clear. First of all, to even raise the question of, does this need to be a linear exhibit? And, you know, also, how do we want to guide visitors and how do we want visitors to just decide where they want to go?
Mhm.
And so with Building a New California, it had a structured timeline because there's this defined timeline of Chinese immigration, you know, building a railroad as part of, you know, the agricultural development in Southern California. Like there was a real need for a strict timeline in the Building a New California exhibit. And with the Tebahagna to today, the Tonga exhibit, of course, like time was still part of it, but we decided that people could move through it in either direction. We had it organized more topically and more thematically, and so there was one kind of, you know, we made one sign kind of larger and obvious that this is your orienting panel to like, this is where the exhibit starts, basically. But if you missed it and went the other way, we really wanted to organize the exhibit that you could start anywhere. That you could look at one case of items and a panel and have a takeaway without feeling lost. So that was something that we built on from previous exhibits was we have this weird space, you know, the elevator plops you in the middle of the room, the stairway, you know, it's an awkward space that we couldn't change. And so we had to work around that. And so by allowing more flexibility of where people can begin and end, that was really helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
So do you plan on doing some more formal curating here now that you're in Valdosta?
Yes, so right now, I am working with students on curating exhibits. I'm working with students on curating exhibits in Odom Library. So that's what my public history classes do. But I saw really great examples when I was a student of professors doing kind of like a guest exhibit at, you know, local museums. Again, working with their students, but like having a different space in the university and having this type of collaboration. So I would love to do something like that. And yeah, that was always kind of in the back of my mind, you know, seeing this model that you can do public history and classroom academic history, whatever that is, you know, and to be able to do both. So I'm very interested in working with opportunities like that. Super grateful that we're able to do exhibits in Odom because we get a lot of support from archives. That's where the items are coming from. New Media Center does our labels. Like it's great that we can do everything that we do in-house. Last year we did an exhibit on Black freedom movement and civil rights movement. This year we're going to do exhibits on women's history. And so these are, you know, exhibits that are supported by collections in Odom, but I'd be very interested in doing exhibits with students and other sites in the area. So if you know anyone.
We'll find them.
Yeah.
Sounds exciting.
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
questions?
I actually have a question. So we went to the Natural History Museum in Florida recently. And I'm very curious, I guess I don't understand the definition of natural history because it felt like I was at a science museum, less so than like a history museum. So I'm curious if you can explain that a little bit. And also, Cordell and I got to talking as to why like the Seminoles were included, Seminole tribe was included in what felt like to me a science museum while I was there. It seemed like it's great that they were being represented, but also like why in that specific setting. So I was just curious like how you as somebody who puts together exhibits like that handle that, I guess, conflict or.
Yeah, I mean, were there like stuff on dinosaurs there also? Was it like
There were
was
like
a whole, like,
mammoths,
two
there's a
sections.
butterfly
Yeah.
garden.
Yeah.
It felt like a science museum more so than anything else. for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a textbook definition for you, but the way that I've interpreted and seen and understood natural history museums is almost like a combination or an in-between space of like science museums and history museums. Because a lot of times science museums will bring in a lot more like technology. But you know, natural history museums are like biological sciences and also archaeology and paleontology a lot of times. And it's like the physical history, I guess, is like another way to look at it. So yeah, I mean, the key difference, a lot of times the people working in natural history museums will come in with more of a science background than a history background. Yeah, and as far as why Indigenous people are featured there, I personally find that perhaps a bit problematic, and I'm saying that as a white person with museum professional background and, you know, my own biases and privilege there, but because again, it supports that idea of Indigenous people as people of the past, right? Like if you're also seeing like fossilized remains of like a mammoth there or something like that, then like that can reinforce the idea of Indigenous people of the past. But I can also see why they made that decision, because Indigenous people have, you know, this generation, millennial long connection with the land and with their environment that is different, better than perhaps Western civilizations, right? And so it's like, it does make sense to connect them to nature and to the land. But I think it again supports that idea of, oh, Indigenous people are in museums because they're of the past, and it's just their baskets and their fossils and their, you know, religious items that don't belong there. It's a whole other conversation, but like, yeah, so I don't have a great answer to that other than Natural History Museum is really that combination of scientific and historic, more of like a physical element, I would say.
And I think the best example of like where I could see that actually working there was in that they had like a whole section where they were talking about the Seminole tribe, just like in their own little wing basically. And they had a part where they were talking about the foundations that they built all of their structures on, and it was all about like the levels of the rock and the things that are between each level and stuff. And it was so neat, and they had this whole wall where you could like, oh, pick out where's the piece of the shattered bottle, where is the nail, this and that. Wow. That makes sense. That like where they fit together makes so much sense. And maybe they just had to establish like their history before they could get into that portion of it. But it felt like that was so insignificant compared to like the huge preface, I guess. I don't know. It was very interesting the way it was structured. So thank you. I appreciate your insight on that. That makes sense.
You know, I'm hesitant to say like, oh, Indigenous people should not be represented in natural history museums. It's just that for a lot of people, that's their only exposure, you know, and even like the languages that museums use, like for instance, we were revising like our, you know, the text, like the language that we use in describing the site's history. And, you know, I pushed them to go through and change what they were saying, because they've been saying for a long time, like, Rancho Los Cerritos, something, since Native American times, before colonization, or something, where I'm like, I get what you're trying to say, but what you're doing is you're creating a timeline where, like, Native American times ends with colonization, and then there's no more, you know? So it's like the language you use, and so, again, I don't know if it's necessarily a problem itself for there to be Indigenous representation in a Natural History Museum. I think there's a place for that, as long as it doesn't end there. And people are also learning about Indigenous communities as part of their community today. Yeah.
Awesome. One thing with the Florida Museum of Natural History that I really liked was that they did have like 2 or 3 full panels on like the Indigenous peoples of day, sort of tying into the Seminoles, the Miccosukee, and like it just end with like the Seminole Wars, like most people in the history of Florida, Indigenous people in Florida had. It did kind of continue into the 20th century into the 21st century a little bit. To kind of like, I agree that like when you with the kind of connotation of a natural history museum, it's like, oh, these are things of the past. But at least this particular museum was trying to move past that connotation.
Yeah, I mean, if they know that that's the connotation, it sounds like they're working to overcome that. You know, another effective thing that we did, and I like to see other museums do, is like make sure that you're not the last word on that topic. because we've talked about this in class, that like exhibits are not books, they're not a full study on something, they're kind of a sampling and they're limited in that way. And so, it's really ideal to provide resources for people to learn more. So ideally, you learn about Indigenous people in an exhibit, and then there's further information of like maybe an Indigenous run museum, ideally, or Indigenous scholars or books or programs or activities or whatever it is that's going on in your community. Again, to emphasize that like you can learn more, and there are Indigenous people in your community that you can learn from. They're not just people who pass through the exhibit.
One of the panels that like mentioned other museums
I love
in
that.
Florida.
That's great.
But you saying that name is what they would remember, not seeing it there.
Yeah.
So some work can still be done to address that.
They also had a panel too that talked about, that it was empty, completely empty, other than they had like a label saying, oh, we're working on getting in conversation with the tribe to actually, because I guess they had artifacts there that were for like funeral rites and stuff.
Right.
Yeah, so they were gone, and they put that in there. Did you
I
get that?
took a picture of that one.
Yeah, that was really cool. It shows
and
what
you
was
can
used
see,
to be
like,
there.
Down here, like it used to be pottery, and then it has why is this empty thing?
It was, yeah, I thought that was.
That's great that they acknowledged it publicly,
Mhm.
because a mistake was made somewhere for them to have those things.
So like you can see their original labels down here.
Yeah.
Like, it used to be like
Yeah.
pottery
Yeah.
items, when they had the why is this empty?
Mhm.
It's because we're collaborating with consulting with Indigenous communities regarding cultural belongings within our collection, to better understand what objects are appropriate for viewing. Through this process, we learned that these items were sacred and funerary objects, so we removed them from our exhibit.
Sounds like they're being pretty responsible. Thanks, Catherine. It sounds like they're being
Yeah,
responsible.
it would have been nice if they'd actually put in, and by the way, it's law.
Yeah, a link to that.
Yeah. By the way, it's a law, we can't have these, it's not just we're being nice.
Yeah. That's true.
Because it makes it sound like, oh, it's been so nice to do this, like, no,
Yeah,
you're required.
Yeah.
They did say
that.
we removed these items from display out of respect, not out of law.
Yeah, you know,
And then they have a commitment to collaboration statement as well.
yeah, which is nice. Well, I want to thank you for this. This has been wonderful. Enjoyed it a great deal, and I think it's going to be really popular, as I think your new, I guess it's not an actual department, but subdiscipline.
Thank you.
I think it's going to be great. And it brings history to life for a lot of people. A lot of people still think that history is boring,
Yeah.
because unfortunately, that's the way it's often taught K through 12.
Right.
And so getting them involved, I think, will make a big difference.
Yeah. So too. Thank you.
So thank you for that. And I thank everybody for coming,
Yeah,
and
thanks for
everybody
coming.
online.
Thanks for being here.
And those who are going to be watching it, enjoy this. Otherwise, we will see you all next time. Have a good day.